Going into the final round of the London Chess Classic 2015, two players shared the lead, Anish Giri and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. Just a half point behind there were three players, Aronian, Grischuk and Carlson. So any one of those five players could still win the tournament. Now, Aronian got nowhere against Vachier-Lagrave. That game ended in a draw. Giri played very safely against Anand. That game also ended in a draw. So that left Magnus Carlsen fighting it out against Alexander Grishuk. If one of those players won, they would share joint first. And what a game this turned out to be. Carlson with the white pieces. Grishuk repeated a game that Carlson had played against Topalov in round one of the Sinkfield Cup. Topalov beat Carlson, but he had an improvement ready, of course. So anyway, this was it was a wild opening, and they arrived at this position after 23 moves. You can see that Carlson is on the attack with his f-pawn. I mean, it looks very much like a Grand Prix attack, but one that's gone pretty well for white, because you can see there's no black g-pawn here. Now the only thing is there's no dark squared bishop, so this is a pretty good defensive piece. You know, white could attempt something like rook f3 and swing the rook across, but in fact it's incredibly difficult to break through. Carlson, well, he played h3 in this position. As we'll see, this can be quite a useful move later on to block the g-file with this move, but I mean, it's quite a deep move in a sense. But there is a downside. You know, these dark squares around the king are pretty weak should the bishop get through, and well, we'll see that has some significance later. So on with the game. Queen e7, a calm move, just overprotecting this pawn and perhaps looking to play bishop b7 to attack e4. So bishop a6, understandable, getting rid of the bishop pair, but that drags the queen offside, and Grishuk seized the moment to overtake the initiative on the king side, knight h5, and now things are really hotting up. You can see this bishop is flying into the position. Diagonal for the queen has opened up, and now rook g8, potentially problems on the g-file. Very interesting position, and here, well, knight e2 looks prudent to cover some dark squares, but there's no doubt that black has the initiative in this position. But instead, Carlson flung his knight out to the side of the board, so now two pieces way off across the other side of the board, and well, this is such a risky decision, but well, let's see what happened. Bishop e5, covering the d-pawn, looking at the dark squares around white's king. I mean, it looks very logical, very dangerous, and of course opening up the g-file. This was the move that Carlson was pinning his hopes on, to block the g-file, and also, you know, looking at these pawns here. But queen h4, and we're reaching crisis point in the game. Carlson now exchanged on f6, but this probably is losing. Grishuk missed a great opportunity here. Of course, he was running short of time, and not easy to see this idea. Rook takes g4. Well, this sacrifice is obvious, and this check, of course, is obvious. This next move, Grishuk had overlooked, knight f4. Threatening queen g2, and if the rook defends, then, well, the best move here, apparently, is just to recapture with the knight. And black simply has a big initiative for the exchange. You know, loads of lines here, but let me show you one which is particularly beautiful. Here's a subtle move, king g7. I like that move very much. I mean, obviously it protects the f-pawn, but also prevents white's queen from bouncing back into the position with a check sometimes. Anyway, this is just for sake of illustration, and I'm not playing the best moves for white either, but this is kind of a fun variation. Now, check. King goes up, and now the knight returning to f4 is extremely dangerous, threatening perhaps a queen e1 check, perhaps a knight g2 check. And if this is taken, then that is a rather beautiful checkmate. Let's go back. Now, instead of rook g4, Grishuk recaptured on e6. Now, not a bad move, but white is probably okay here. Knight takes e5, played by Carlson. And here, probably best play should result in a draw. Queen e1 check is probably best. And, well, Grischuk had seen that after rook f1 he would be able to force a draw with rook g2, and then that's just perpetual check on g3 and h3. What he didn't like was king h2, but in fact black wins after this. Both players had seen this position and thought that after knight g4 it was white that was winning here. But in fact both players had missed knight e2. In the cold light of day, it doesn't seem terribly difficult. A curious double oversight, and there's no satisfactory defence to queen g1 and its forced mate. So anyway, queen e1 should have led to a draw, but Grishuk just recaptured an e5. Suddenly the queen came back into play, threatening things here. Even here, black should be okay after queen g5. But instead, in time pressure, Grishuk went for it with this rook sack, but here I'm afraid the checks run out. I mean, black has lots of checks here, but eventually white can defend himself. And here, well, there was a flurry of moves in time pressure, but after this Grishuk resigned. One more check, king h2, and the king is safe, and then white does the biz at the other end of the board with these guys. Well, great pity. Grishuk risked a great deal in this game. Well, both players risked a great deal, actually. But finally, Magnus's nerves, strong nerves, pulled him through. So that meant that three players shared first. Giri, Vachier-Lagrave and Carlson. Then they had a really odd playoff. Basically, on tiebreak, using the Sonneborn-Burger system, Carlson had the best tiebreak, and the rules stated, I think they devised these rules long ago at the start of the Grand Chess Tour. The rules stated that the two players with the worst tiebreak should play off two 25-minute games, and the winner would then play Carlson in a final. I mean, this is ridiculous. Anyway, Giri and Vachier-Lagrave played two 25-minute games. It was 1-1. Both players won a game, and then they had a sudden death blitz game, which Vachier-Lagrave won. I mean, so that all that took over 2 hours, and then there was a short break, and then Vachier-Lagrave played against Carlson. So his reward for an enervating match, a speed chess match against Giri, was to play against Carlson. Of course, Carlson a bit fresher. Let me show you the first game in this two-game match. 25 minutes on the clock for both players. Carlson was grinding away, and you can see that here with the white pieces he certainly has some advantage. He has a space advantage. The rook and knight are very active, and his king active. Here white wants to play knight d6. For example, if rook b4 here, then knight d6, and after the exchange then white is winning that c5 pawn. That's the basic threat. If f5 check, then the king comes forward, and well, the king is going to break through, and yeah, e6 is weak. The king is terrible here, and that's good for white. But black does have a defence here, which Vachier-Lagrave found. h6, very, very subtle move. The point is that if knight d6 now, then f5 is a good move, because the king can no longer come into g5, and after the exchange, black exchanges, and the knight drops back to d7, covering the pawn and also preventing white's king breaking through, so that would be a draw. So h6 is a really subtle move. The best that Carlson could find was to play rook c7, but here once again f5 is a saving move. If the king steps to the side, then f3 drops, so really white has to exchange. And now black is able to push white's pieces away, and although the c5 pawn goes, he can take on f3. It's a long sequence. Pawns are still even, although black is a bit passive. In fact, he's fine, and with so many pawns being exchanged, this position should be a draw, but watch what happens. Rook f2, Vachier-Lagrave playing perfectly at this point. More pawns being exchanged. C-pawn advances, but of course black has counterplay on the other side of the board. With so few pawns, it must be a draw. For example, if white pushes, well, he can win this knight on e8. But of course, rook against rook and knight is a draw, a pretty easy draw, far easier than rook and bishop against rook. So Carlson tried something else. He played knight d6. So knights exchanged. Black has this under control, and he has counterplay on the other side of the board. But I mean, I thought they were going to agree a draw very shortly here. But Carlson found a way to keep just a little bit of pressure on the Frenchman. He played g4, so keeping pawns on the board. Should still be a draw. If the pawn advances, then of course you can check. White's rook would have to block, you exchange, and the king collects. So white has to play king e5. Rook h1. Black still has everything under control here, because that rook can come around to pick up that pawn if necessary. Well, after d7, in fact, the king picks up the pawn. Rook d1 would be a mistake here. Rook takes pawn, and you can exchange rooks, and white wins that. So king e7. This is still fine for black. But it's incredible how Magnus has managed to keep testing black, making him make big decisions, and we're coming to a big decision here. Rook and 1 against rook and 1. How do you draw this with black? Well, Maxime played rook f1, and it turns out to be a mistake. Let's see how black can draw. h2. And now the most testing move is to play rook e2, keeping black's king cut off from the g-pawn. Now black can still go wrong here. For example, if you play rook f1, then rook takes pawn, and if rook f8, then the rook comes back into action. The point is this: you check again, and if the king crosses to the f-file, white exchanges rooks, and that's a winning king and pawn endgame. And if king d6, then the king is too far away from black's pawn, and white can simply shuffle down the board with his king and pawn. So rook f1 would lose, but rook a1 avoids all that, and this is a draw. There's a threat to play rook check and win the rook, so white doesn't have time to play g5. And if rook e2, for example, getting out of that, cutting off the king, then this is just a draw. You keep checking, the king has to go back, behind the pawn, and this is a theoretical draw. For example, rook e4, the king comes up, and yeah, if the rook comes here, you get closer, and if king f3, Okay, this is still, it's a well-known drawing mechanism. Yeah, so in this position, h2 would have drawn, but Maxime played rook f1, and in this case, this is no longer a draw. King g6 is winning. There was a little bit of shuffling went on, but there is no defense here. And after this, the rook cut off the king, and that's that. If rook a8, king h6, and the g-pawn goes home. So incredible. Maxime defended brilliantly, but I'm afraid right at the end he blew it. Poor guy, he must have been exhausted. In the second 25-minute game, Magnus, well, got a winning position very easily. Well, eventually there were repeated moves. It was so draw, and Magnus won the tournament. So incredible. After a slow start, Magnus pulled through right at the end. Not only did he win the tournament, but he also won the Grand Chess Tour 2015 overall. Incredible. Very, very close. If you want full details of an extraordinary final day, please do check out chessbase.com for all the news. Thanks very much for watching. The Qatar Open, incredibly strong tournament, is coming up in six days' time, so watch out for my reports on that one. And if you like this channel, do subscribe to Powerplay Chess on youtube.com. It's free, and well, I produce regular videos such as this. Thanks for watching.